thank you, and thank you for the kind invitation and the chance to reflect on this excellent book, which I enjoyed working through. So, Father Mariusz's central goal is concisely stated on the very first page of the book, where he says, quote, "The main objective of this book is to contribute to and further develop the contemporary Aristotelian-Thomistic account of the theory of evolution in both its philosophical and theological dimensions," unquote. So I'll read that quote again. So the main objective of the book is to contribute to and further develop the contemporary Aristotelian-Thomistic account of the theory of evolution in both its philosophical and theological dimensions. And so there's a few components of that sort of overarching goal for the book, right? One is that Father Mariusz is giving an account of evolution, right? So he's giving a model of thinking about the evolutionary process in accordance with Christianity in general, and then Thomism more specifically. Which is notable because, of course, there's still a lot of not only just Christians, but also some Thomists who, in their writings on evolution, are trying to more sort of counter evolutionary ideas, or still pushing for some kind of creationism of one sort or another, anti-Darwinian perspectives. There are still some Thomists who are going that route. And so it's notable that Father Mariusz decided to take a different approach and sort of go the route more of accepting the basic truth of much of the evolutionary framework and then trying to demonstrate how it links up with traditional scholastic ways of thinking. So an account of evolution rather than an attempt to disprove some components of the evolutionary story. The other feature of the overarching message of the book is that this is a contemporary Aristotelian-Thomistic account. So obviously he draws on historical sources. This came up even in his brief overview of the book this morning. So definitely drawing on not only Aquinas, but also earlier prominent Thomists who were writing about evolution, including folks from the 19th century and more recent people like Jacques Maritain and other figures. So it's contemporary in the sense also, though, that he's interacting with some of the cutting-edge research in analytic metaphysics and in theoretical biology. So it's a historically grounded work, but one that's still very much engaging with the most recent literature. So it's a contemporary account. And as he describes it, it's an Aristotelian-Thomistic account. And this is notable because, of course, scholasticism, both historically and to some extent still today, is a big tent, right? You've got a lot of different scholastic systems or syntheses of thought. You've Scotism still exists, kind of. There are still some folks who are plugging for Scotism as a living body of thought. The Bonaventurianism, even, there are still some Bonaventure scholars who are pushing some of the distinctives of his system. And of course, historically, there's a whole variety of scholastic systems that were widely taught throughout university system and widely read. And so it is worth emphasizing that he's looking to give a specifically Thomist account of evolution. And one of the mild sort of criticisms I have is that there's some aspects of the project where I kind of question, well, just how Thomistic is this approach as opposed to sort of generically scholastic? But there's definitely some portions of the book which are very distinctively Thomistic, where the specific commitments of Thomism in contrast to other scholastic systems becomes a really important part of the story. And so I'll highlight some of that as well. So that's just a bit by way of clarifying the overarching aim of the work, which again he notes right on the very first page of the book. Now, by way of just giving a bit of additional background framing for the project, so there's different ways of engaging with evolutionary theory, or in fact scientific developments more generally, from either a Christian or a specifically Thomistic framework. So, and these different approaches take different, they're more or less ambitious, right? So one kind of way of approaching evolutionary theory from a Christian perspective or a Thomist perspective would be to say, look, just try to demonstrate a basic compatibility, right? Just aim to show there's nothing in evolutionary theory which outright contradicts Christian doctrine or Thomistic theory, right? That's sort of the, while an important project, and it's one that lots of folks have taken up over the years, again, it's sort of the least ambitious, right? You're just trying to show basic compatibility. Another more robust project would be to attempt to show that Thomistic ideas line up with or even anticipate aspects of evolutionary theory, right? So you're going beyond mere compatibility to show a kind of consilience. And then the most ambitious approach would be to try to show that Thomistic principles can be put to work actually solving contemporary puzzles in evolutionary theory. Right, so you've got this ascending scale of ambition in terms of your project, and there are elements of each of these that I think are evident in the book, right? From the just attempts at showing basic compatibility, right up to showing that no, there are problems in contemporary theory that Thomism can productively address, and so that's worth bearing in mind as well. Because again, different authors will approach this in different ways, and it's notable of this book, you see elements of each of these three approaches in play. Personally, I think this is a really worthwhile project on all three of these fronts. I agree with Father Mariusz that much of evolutionary theory is basically true, and that in consequence, Christian scholars are obligated to engage with it and think through the details of how it fits within our worldview. That said, I do have more sympathy with aspects of intelligent design theory and old Earth creationism than I think Father Mariusz does, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on in the talk. But yeah, the basic notion that there's a great deal of truth in evolutionary theory that Christians are obligated to try to think through and approach from a distinctively Christian perspective. Totally on board with that. So in what follows, what I'm going to do is mostly focus on some thoughts concerning the introductory chapter and then the first few chapters after that. So the way the book is organized, as you pointed out this morning, the introductory chapters are largely laying out approaching evolutionary theory from its mystic perspective, looking at the background, metaphysics, and philosophy of nature. And so that's mostly what I'll be focusing on. The second half of the book gets more into distinctively theological areas. I'll say something about that, but less, since obviously this is not my main wheelhouse as principally a philosophy of science guy. In the introductory chapter, Father Mariusz provides an accessible overview of recent developments within evolutionary theory, with a special eye to those developments which arguably depart in certain respects from what was the sort of previously dominant neo-Darwinian synthesis. And so these include things like the theory of punctuated equilibrium and its role in speciation, the notion of exaptation, the Evo-Devo movement, which Professor Austin also talked about in his presentation, and then developments in complexity theory and the notion of self-organization. So taking these together, these shifts in evolutionary thinking suggest to some biologists that there's a need for an overarching reconsideration of the neo-Darwinian synthesis in favor of theories that take into account a broader range of explanatory factors within evolution. So in the introductory chapter, Father Mariusz sort of summarizes those developments in recent biology, and then sort of reaffirms that he's going to be taking this more ambitious approach of Thomistic engagement. So he writes on page 8, quote, what becomes crucial for a philosopher of the Aristotelian-Thomistic orientation is that the new developments in evolutionary biology described above provide new opportunity for the retrieval of some of the crucial categories of classical metaphysics, unquote. In other words, there's notions that are coming up in the contemporary theoretical biology that actually points us back towards elements of traditional Thomism, which again is a pretty bold claim. Moreover, he says that those principles show promise of accomplishing uniquely helpful work on behalf of biology since, quote, hylomorphism may also contribute to the further development of the philosophical interpretation of the theories of complexity and self-organization. In particular, the category of formal cause, defined as a metaphysical principle providing for the identity and the active and passive dispositions of a given entity, may be seen as grounding the unique potential of inanimate matter to spontaneously and instantaneously emerge into a primitive living system, unquote. So again, kind of a preview of some of the more ambitious claims that he'll be getting through in the remainder of the book. So in chapter 1, he then turns to supplying a helpful overview of Thomistic holomorphism in general, emphasizing its distinctive understanding of the codependence of prime matter and substantial form. So this is the idea so again, there's different versions of holomorphism within scholastic thought, and one of the distinctives of Thomistic holomorphism is the notion that prime matter and substantial form are really deeply codependent. So prime matter can never exist on its own independently of substantial form. It only exists insofar as it's instantiated by, actualized by some kind of substantial form. Another feature of holomorphism that he emphasizes is the unicity of substantial form. So this is the notion that every physical substance is actualized by only one substantial form at a given time, which again is something that differs. It's a distinctive Thomistic commitment that other scholastic systems disagree about. And because of these two commitments, he's also committed to the Thomistic notion of virtual presence. So this is the idea that, so this is actually one of the toughest components of Thomism to wrap one's head around if you're not used to it, and it's very nicely explained in the book. But the core idea is just that because a physical substance only has a single substantial form that is actualizing the prime matter, all of the what we would normally label as like lower level components or elements of a given substance, they no longer have substantial forms of their own. Those substances have sort of been completely absorbed by the identity of the larger whole, such that they still exist as sort of what Aquinas sort of calls a virtual presence, right? So they exist in a sense, but only virtually within this new whole into which they've been integrated. So for example, like the water molecules that go to constitute part of my current physical frame, Aquinas would say that they no longer exist as ordinary water molecules. Instead, they've been taken up as part of me. They're part of my overarching substance. So their powers exist in a sense. And the notion of their having a virtual existence is really important because Aquinas affirms that they can be extracted from my physical whole and regain their original status as substances in their own right. But as they exist in me, they're not substances of their own. And so that's an important distinctive part of the Thomistic account here and sort of entailed by this unicity of substantial form commitment. To his credit, Father Marius recognizes that here he's getting into some difficult and contentious metaphysical territory, but he considers all of these to be important commitments of Thomism. So he says this on pages 27, 28, quote, they need to be kept at the risk of departing from hylomorphism towards meromorphism, which assumes that substantial form unites parts that retain their substantial identity. This would suggest that the same portion of matter is actualized by more than one form, which is counterintuitive, as one thing cannot have simultaneously two separate identities, unquote. So here is one part of the book where, again, I think some scholastics will want to push back because, again, the notion, so this unicity of substantial forms thesis is something that Scotists historically are really keen to deny. Other scholastics push back against this, and so they would question his claim that you need this unicity of substantial form thesis, or otherwise you're going to fall into claiming that one substance can simultaneously have two separate identities, which would obviously seem kind of contradictory. So they would want to push back against that notion, so that's one thing that one might sort of highlight as something that, as a really distinctively Thomistic claim that he's making here. But it's interesting that I think, even this is something that, though this is something that he's reaffirming here, and rightly so, because it is a distinctive commitment of Thomism, I don't think there's too much in the way of central claims. So in terms of the actual engagement with evolutionary theory, I don't think there's much in the book that actually really requires this. Maybe we can go have some discussion about that later on, maybe. But it's my sense that although he is reaffirming some of these distinctively Thomistic claims early on, I'm not sure they're playing that central a role in much of the rest of the argumentation, especially in the portions of the book that are concentrating more on the metaphysics and philosophy of nature side of things. The unicity of substantial form, I think, does become important for some of the theological claims that come up in the second half of the book, but I think they're not as important for the metaphysical claims, which I just want to highlight here because I think there's other varieties of scholastics, I think, can probably agree with most of what he's saying in the metaphysics, philosophy of nature portions of the book. So if you happen to have secret Bonaventurian sympathies or something, you shouldn't be scared off from the book, because I think you could agree with just about everything he's saying when it comes to interaction with contemporary evolutionary theory on a metaphysical philosophy of nature level. I think where some of the distinctively Thomistic stuff becomes more important is more in the theological areas of the book. At least that's my impression. You might want to push back against some of this. I'm not sure. However, Father Marius does float another idea that is liable to be controversial actually amongst some Thomists. And it's a tangential point. He just raises it in a footnote, but I think this is really metaphysically interesting, so I wanted to highlight it here. So he says this on page 25, again, and it's just in a footnote, but he says the following, quote, "We must acknowledge that apart from living beings, the question concerning substantiality of things, that is, the distinction between mere aggregates of lower-level substances versus higher substances that emerge in the process of substantial change of several lower substances, becomes a challenge. Thus, Andrew von Melson suggests we should speak about degrees of self-existence or individuality and substantiality. Concerning the latter, von Melson claims that actual substantial forms, the actual fundamental determinations of matter, do not have the idealized form which they have in our theoretical concepts. They are realized in a deficient or rather mixed way. For this reason, the distinction between substantial and accidental form has to be taken in a relative sense." Unquote. So von Melson's idea here, as interpreted by Father Marius, is that the substantiality of concrete compound particulars might be a matter of degree. And this would be an interesting way of trying to think through some of the complexities of the special composition problem outside the realm of biology, which indeed can be pretty daunting. So the problem here is trying to figure out, like, when do you have a mere heap of individual substances that do not form a larger whole, versus when do you have things genuinely coming together to form a larger substantial compound, right? So in standard Aristotelianism, you would probably say that, like, this chair is a mere aggregate. It's not actually a substance in its own right. It's just a coming together of a bunch of smaller substances in a certain shape. So the chair is a mere aggregate. It's an artificial thing. Whereas Aristotle's standard example of a genuine substance is a biological organism, right? Which is a compound. Sure, there's lots of substances that go into to making up this biological organism, but there's just one substance there. And the question is, well, where exactly do you draw the line between a mere aggregate of substances versus a genuine new whole, which is a novel substance in its own right? And what von Melson was suggesting, I think what Father Marius is suggesting as well, is that this is indeed difficult in some cases to work out precisely. Like, I've seen debates in sort of scholastic philosophy of nature of, like, is a molecule genuinely a substance in its own right, or is it a mere compound of atoms? It's hard to figure that out, right, and to come up with a really principled way of answering that question. We'd like to think that you can have clearer answers to that kind of question in the biological realm, but in lower level realms, if we're dealing with the realm of chemistry, this might actually seem much tougher to solve. And so von Melson's suggestion with Father Marius is sort of entertaining in this footnote is, well, maybe the way to deal with some of these ambiguities is just to grant that substantiality can actually just come in degrees. So maybe the way to think about the molecule is to say that, well, the molecule is more of a substance than the chair, maybe, but less of a substance than a biological organism, and just that granted substantiality might come in degrees. Now, I think this is actually a really interesting idea of how to think about what in the analytic literature is sometimes referred to as sort of the problem of the special composition problem, right? When does a set of substances, when do they come together to form a genuinely novel whole or substance? However, I think here, though, one reason why I think some scholastics will push back against this notion is that here we're departing from scholastic tradition in a pretty major way, I think, actually, that the notion that you could have a kind of middle ground between the substantial and the accidental. I think that's something that I think Aristotle is pretty clearly against in his original works, and I think something that scholastics generally historically would not have really been on board with. I think it's actually, I'm actually okay with the idea that we might have either, that substance either might come in degrees, or that you might have kinds of ontological categories that are neither substantial nor accidental. I'm open to all of that, but I think a lot of scholastics are going to be really leery of this particular suggestion, which again does not play a big role in the remainder of the argumentation, but it's just a neat sort of controversial point that comes up. I wanted to draw attention to. Now, Father Marius goes on to note that within Thomism, the notion of a hierarchy of kinds of substances is also important. And he provides an extensive quote from the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, which brings this out nicely, where... and the hierarchy, by the way, is... So the hierarchy that he mentions is... So Aquinas draws attention to, you've got the four elements as one kind of level of being, then you've got plants, then you've got non-rational animals, and you've got rational animals, and you've got angels, right? You've got this hierarchy of being. And within Thomism, this is a hierarchy. This is kind of a tripartite hierarchy, where it's a hierarchy of... it's an ontological hierarchy, a teleological hierarchy, and an axiological hierarchy all at the same time, right? As you move up the levels of being, things become more valuable. And they also, it's a teleological hierarchy in the sense that the lower level beings are oriented towards the good of the higher level beings, right? One of the reasons the elements are there is to allow for the construction of biological organisms. And biological organisms are there to form this bridge between the incorporeal realm of the angels and the purely material realm, which is us, right? We are this middle ground between these two realms. So I think it was good that he highlighted the fact that there is these different kinds of hierarchies at play in the Thomistic system. So all this preceding material on hylomorphism constitutes part of the background for Father Marius's larger discussion of the metaphysics of substantial change in general, and more specifically, the kind of substantial change which is crucial for evolutionary theory, namely speciation. So he says... he talked about this morning, but I'm just going to read out one of his longer quotes laying out the basic model here, because I think this is a really important part of his larger case here. Quote, "An evolutionary transition might thus be defined in this account as a series of minor genetic and epigenetic changes that affect minor phenotypic variations or accidental changes, and these variations, remaining within the range of active and passive powers typical for a given species or natural kind, may become permanent, in other words, transmitted from one generation to the next, which in turn gradually changes the proximate disposition of prime matter underlying subsequent organisms of a lineage L1 of the species S1. This process, highly complex and extended in time, might lead to a precise instant at which the prime matter underlying the egg and sperm coming from particular male and female organisms of sexually reproducing species S1 at their entering the substantial change in which they join and give an origin to a new organism is not disposed to be actualized by the old type of substantial form that defines the original species, but by a new type of substantial form that defines a new species, which is adduced in the potentiality of the prime matter that underlies them," unquote. So, the basic thought here to restate that a little bit. So the model is basically one in which individual organisms will, for a variety of internal and environmental reasons, have various kinds of buildup of accidental changes, which some of which can be passed on to their offspring, and over time, as the weight of these changes accumulate, you might eventually hit a point where two members of a single species will, if we're talking about sexual reproduction, two members of a given species might reproduce, and their offspring might actually, as kind of the end point of this long series of smaller accidental changes, their offspring might actually belong to a new and different natural kind, which differs from either of the original parents. And this becomes a sort of, this is a suggestion of the sort of hylomorphic model of how to think through the metaphysics of speciation on a Thomistic framework, which I think is an entirely reasonable way of looking at it. And I think, in fact, any hylomorphic model of evolutionary change, whether it's Thomistic or some other form of scholastic ontology, is probably going to look very much like this. So I think he's hit upon basically the right way of thinking about this. One bit of pushback, though, that he might get from some folks in theoretical biology is this model of speciation is obviously open to the idea, even maybe committed to the idea, that a single organism is sort of the locus of speciation. Like a brand new organism can arise which is genuinely belonging to a species that neither of its parent organisms belong to. That's going to make some evolutionary biologists a little uncomfortable, right? They much prefer talking about evolutionary change at the population level. And so the notion that you might just get a new organism arising as itself belonging to a brand new species is something that some of them are going to be uncomfortable with. That said, there's definitely folks in the philosophy of biology literature who have argued that, well, no, when you get right down to it, there's got to be some X point where the new species arises, unless the whole process is just going to be ineliminably vague, just blurry borderlines. If a genuinely new species is arising which is distinct from prior species, some philosophers of biology have argued that no, there does actually have to be a genuine, at some point, a new organism that belongs to a new species. So just to point out the fact here, it's not a criticism, it's just to point out the fact that there's very much a debate about this particular point within the philosophy of biology literature. But I think he's right that from a hylomorphic perspective, you need to take a stand on that debate. He also points out in this chapter that we probably should not be using the word species univocally across all contexts, both metaphysical and biological. Right? That when we're talking about natural kinds, sometimes if we're talking about a natural kind in the metaphysical sense as something which is instantiating a given substantial form, that might not always track with what a biologist might take to be a distinctive biological species. So what this means is that there might be cases in which something that the Thomist with his philosopher of nature hat on might identify as a member of a given biological kind, which when he then puts a biologist hat on would say, no, that's not really a member of a kind in the biological sense. We're talking about something else in this other context. And I think that's completely legitimate. I think that the species language is probably not univocal across all concepts. But just to highlight one potential risk of accepting a degree of analogical language use here is that we might get kind of lazy with it. And he doesn't, by the way. I'm just saying that Thomists taking this approach might fall into this trap of trying to avoid certain objections against their metaphysics by falling back on claims of, well, equivocation, or that we're talking about something different in a given context. So, for example, if the hylomorphic account of speciation seems to indicate that these two organisms are actually members of the very same natural kind, whereas the biologist then steps in and says, well, wait a second, though, in our taxonomical practices, we actually identify these two organisms as belonging to different biological species for the following reasons. The Thomists at that point might just say, well, but in this case, I'm talking about species in the metaphysical sense. I'm not talking about it in the sense of, well, precisely what we mean when we're engaged in biological taxonomy in a contemporary context. And there'll be some cases where that's perfectly fine, but there's going to be other cases where you might be dealing with a genuinely troubling metaphysical counterexample, where what you really want to do is just think through the metaphysics of the given case rather than sort of fall back on a claim of equivocal language. And this goes on all the time. I mean, there's lots of different competing concepts of species in philosophy of biology. In fighting back and forth about this, it's common to raise counterexamples. So for example, just to toss out one example from this sort of body of literature. So the so-called biological species concept basically says that to be a member of a given species is to belong to a given lineage and to be able to reproduce fertile offspring with other members of that species, right? So members of a given biological kind on that concept of species is a matter of lineage plus reproductive ability, basically. Now, of course, one common criticism against that very common species concept is to point out that, well, that fails to incorporate asexually reproducing organisms. And so it leaves out 90% of the biological organisms on our planet. And so if you want a concept of species which is going to be generally applicable, that one's not going to work very well because it leaves out bacteria and all these other sorts of things. Now, in theory, what the advocate of the biological species concept could come back, they could just come back and say, well, look, I mean something different by the word species in this context, right? Bacteria or something, I'm just not trying to deal with them in this theory. Where they just adopt an equivocal language approach and say that bacteriologists are working with a different notion of species or a different term than we are. Which you could do, but that might be viewed as sort of outside the bounds of debate within philosophy of biology. So I would just worry that if we adopt an equivocal language approach to some of this stuff, we might be tempted to go too far with sidestepping certain kinds of criticisms. So pressing ahead a little bit further to talk about some other claims in the book. I'm on board with just about everything he says by way of defining intrinsic biological essentialism. So he gives a really nice account of this on page 81 of the book, laying out sort of the core of a hylomorphic account of intrinsic biological essentialism. And again, I think just about any hylomorphist who is on board with this kind of biological essentialism will have to say something very similar. The one thing I would just highlight, though, is that Father Marius's account of intrinsic biological essentialism is particularly robust insofar as, if I've understood him correctly, he's basically saying that membership in a given biological species is entirely determined by its intrinsic substantial form. That's all that you need to belong to a given biological species. Now, that is one way to go within philosophy of biology and scholastic philosophy of biology. So David Oderberg, for example, takes basically the same stance. And so it's definitely a defensible position, but it's not quite the position that I take. I defend a slightly different account of biological essentialism where what I try to do is accommodate what is the dominant view in biology, that membership in a given species, that for a given organism to belong to a given species, most biologists would claim that even if there might be some intrinsic characteristics that figure into the membership, there's also got to be some facts about lineage. That you've got to belong to a given parent. Like, in other words, so just to use a common thought experiment that is often employed in talking about this. So imagine that when we travel to Mars, and we travel to Mars and we realize that Mars is actually a lush, verdant place with all kinds of animal species, and we discover that there's a species on Mars which is just to the outward observer indistinguishable from cats. They look like cats, they act like cats. In fact, they even do a genetic analysis and they realize the genetic code of these animals is seemingly indistinguishable from cats on Earth. It's just this unbelievably bizarre instance of convergent evolution where the environment on Mars was such that evolution kicked up what looked like cats. So the question is, well, are these really cats? You could bring Earth cats to Mars and they could mate successfully and produce fertile offspring. You can say that, right? Do these Martian cats count as genuine cats? Well, to Oderberg, and I think also for Marius, the answer would be an obvious yes. This is an instance where somehow the substantial form feline has been instantiated on this other planet. And so, since all that's involved in belonging to a given biological kind is instantiating a given substantial form, these cats are genuine cats. However, the dominant view in theoretical biology would actually say no. To belong to the species cat, it's not enough to have a given set of intrinsic characteristics. You also have to belong to a given lineage. In other words, you have to be a member, you have to belong to this historical chain of ancestors that go back to the originating speciation event. Why does any of this matter? Well, personally, I think this actually has some theological relevance, because if you look at the theology of the incarnation, some of the church fathers debate this question of, well, why did God become incarnate through St. Mary? Why didn't God just create a new physical form de novo and become incarnate in that totally new physical form? So this is a question you find also in some scholastics, right? Why didn't God just create a brand new physical body and become incarnate in that? Why work through a human woman? Well, some fathers and some scholastics, there's a variety of answers to this, but some of them give the following answer. Some of them answer that, well, God had to do this through St. Mary, or through some human woman in principle. God had to do this through an existing human woman because otherwise he would not have genuinely become human. Becoming human means entering into the genus of Adam, right? Entering into this lineage that goes back to the first couple, which is an interesting kind of prefigurement of this idea in contemporary biology, that belonging to a certain biological kind entails belonging to a given lineage. So that's one reason why I wanted to just briefly highlight that point just to kick in some additional theology here. I mentioned earlier that I'm a little more open to intelligent design theory and to old Earth creationism than Father Marius. Just to say something very briefly about that, this might just be a difference in assessing the empirical sort of literature on this. And I grant that I'm not a scientist. I have no business trying to assess empirical arguments for intelligent design within biology. But my just sense is that some of this is actually, and going by what some reputable biologists in this literature have said, some of this I think is kind of compelling, particularly when it comes to the origin of life stuff. So I was attending a conference on Thomism and evolution a couple of years ago at Providence College. And there was a Catholic biologist there. I should have double-checked her name. I'm blocking on it at the moment. But she had the argument that, in her opinion, as a biologist, once life is on the table, all evolutionary changes after that can be adequately explained using pretty standard Darwinian mechanisms. But, she said, the research into origin of life has just hit a total brick wall, and we just have no idea how the first biological cells could possibly have arisen by chance. And so her view was that you need divine intervention at least for the transition point between non-life to life. Whereas I take it that, I think Marius's claim is more that, well, no, prime matter has enough breadth of potency intrinsic to it that it can actually have the potential to give rise directly to life through the instantiation of the right substantial form. So I think he takes the view that you don't need divine intervention even for the origin of life, whereas I think that's one point where I would want to push back and sort of point to some of these Catholic biologists who are claiming that no, there's actually empirical evidence to support at least divine intervention at that level. I'm open to divine intervention at any manner of level. God can do what he likes. But I think at least for the origin of life, we've got really good empirical evidence on that point, from what I can tell as a non-biologist. So thanks very much.